Hi, I'm Tom McNamee. I'm the editorial page editor at the Chicago Sun-Times, and we're going to have an editorial board meeting with the candidates for Illinois Attorney General. We're live streaming this, so if you have questions, go to Facebook, Sun-Times page on Facebook, and drop us a line, ask a question. We'll try to get a few of these questions into our meeting. It's only about an hour long. It's very informal, but we'll do our best to accommodate your questions too. So with us today on ours, I'd like to let everybody introduce themselves. I'm Tom McNamee, editorial page editor.
I'm Marilyn Garcia. To the left of Kwame, Raoul. I'm on the editorial board.
And we'll go over here first.
Start with me. I'm Chris Fusco. I'm the editor-in-chief.
Thomas Frisbee, editorial board writer.
Lorraine Forte. I'm an editorial writer as well.
Mark Brown, I'm a columnist.
Okay, and then we have our candidates, and we have Bubba Harsy. Thanks for being here. You're the Libertarian candidate, and Erika Harold, the Republican candidate, and Kwame Raoul, the Democratic candidate. I understand this is your first debate among each other.
It is.
Oh, that's great. So we get the first of it. So I think what I'd like to do first is today there are two stories in the Sun-Times, which I suspect you've all read, by PolitiFact, Chicago Sun-Times, and and the BGA, Better Government Association, where they rate the factuality of advertisements and campaigns. And in each case, or in two of the cases, the rating is that it's false or mostly false. Erika, your advertisement with respect to a tax increase that you pin on Kwame and Speaker Madigan, they rate mostly false. And then there's another ad involving same-sex couples and adoption by Mr. Raoul that we also rate false. And so I'd like to start with the first of those ads right now. In your ad, Erika, the basic idea was there was a bill passed that would allow the city to reduce or restructure worker retirement benefits, and then the city and the employees would have to kick in more money to help bring these pensions up to proper funding. As part of that, the original bill would allow the city to raise taxes. It's something, as I understand it, Rahm Emanuel asked for. There was a hue and cry, among others, by former Governor Quinn, and the part of the bill that would have allowed for the increase in taxes was stripped out of the bill, which then passed. PolitiFact, sometimes BGA, assessed the ad as inaccurate in saying that Mr. Raoul and Speaker Madigan had raised taxes. Then, in fact, there was no tax increase. It was stripped out of the bill. And that really was not the intent of the bill to begin with. Can you talk about that?
So we were very careful with the words that we used. We said that they teamed up to raise property taxes. It's undisputed that the original bill, as introduced, would in fact have allowed for a property tax increase. The fact that they failed to accomplish that doesn't change the fact that that's what it was designed to do. Certainly there may be rationale for why Rahm Emanuel wanted that, but it does not change the fact that that was what was the piece of legislation that Senator Raoul and Speaker Madigan introduced. They were the chief co-sponsors of that. And so that's a reason why CBS, when they actually fact-checked that specific fact, they rated that as true.
Is that a fair reading?
No, it's not. Clearly, as has been reported, the intention was to allow the city to give the city some tools to address their pension liability that was a huge burden on the city and continues to be a huge burden on the city. Nothing in it mandated, even in the original proposed bill, nothing mandated the city council and city government to raise taxes. It was to allow tools for the city to deal with a situation that nobody could argue was a situation that they had to confront.
Could you be criticized for allowing the city to have the tool of raising taxes?
Arguably, they have that tool already.
Mm-hmm. It is just a tool, right? And number two is, wasn't the bill primarily about something altogether different, which was to change the contributions to the pension systems to begin with?
There were several facets of the bill, but again, it is a fact that part of that piece of legislation as introduced was to allow the city to be able to raise property taxes. That's what Rahm Emanuel wanted. The whole point of that was to generate additional revenue. And so the fact that there were perhaps good intentions in doing that doesn't change the fact that for families that found their property taxes going up, that would have been something that would have been extremely problematic. That's why there was a lot of outcry as a result of it when this was introduced, because people were thinking, I've watched Springfield continue to waste my money. They are the reasons why we have some of these pension issues, and now they want to put it on us by trying to raise our property taxes. So the fact that they did not ultimately succeed in the objective doesn't change the fact that that's what it was designed to do in terms of being able to allow to increase property taxes.
Designed in part to do.
Designed in part, that is fine, but it's still a fact that was one of the things that it was designed to do. That is a fact.
Let me ask a second question with respect to ads then, and then I'll move on to other folks, but this is kind of a twofer. It all gets down to the question of whether or not the current incumbent state legislators, the Speaker of the House, are working for the people or working for themselves. And you have put out ads in which you have suggested that Speaker Madigan is just corrupt. There's a quote, in Illinois, politicians have turned corruption into an art form. And I think Speaker Madigan's photo, looking rather dangerous, is in
We
that.
chose a photo that portrays him as he is. So.
And Mr. Raoul. And you say Illinois politicians have turned corruption into an art form. You criticize Senator Raoul and Madigan for working hand in hand against the people. Is that productive and useful when you're trying to do things in a bipartisan basis? Let me read a quote from former Governor Jim Edgar just yesterday, and he clearly was speaking directly to Governor Rauner. He was at Millikan University, and he said, if I may find this quote, in Illinois, we don't call people names. We don't question someone's integrity because they have another point of view. We don't call them a crook because they don't agree with us. Governor Edgar clearly felt that Governor Rauner, when he suggested Madigan is corrupt and those who work with them are therefore corrupt, is making it impossible for functioning government to work in Illinois. What do you say?
I would say that when you look at the way our property tax system is set up, I think the voters would agree with me that it is a scheme. It's a scheme by which people are able to set property tax policy within the legislature. They are then able to run side businesses and actually be able to profit handsomely as a result of that. There's a reason why Berrios lost his election. There's a reason why Berrios was sued on the count of the disparate impact that people felt who didn't have the ability to hire high-priced lawyers. And this has been going on for years and years and years. And it has a disproportionate impact upon people who find the value of their home inflated. They don't have the ability to be able to hire a high-priced attorney, and you have the same cycle perpetuating. When I travel around the state of Illinois, people talk about the fact that their property taxes continue to increase. And so I would argue that it's your job, if you were running for Attorney General, to be able to confront those issues. I would also argue that if you're in the legislature, it is your job to stand up and to try to advocate on behalf of the people who need you to break up that scheme. I argue it is a scheme, and I stand by that. And I stand by the fact that Senator Raoul was, instead of actually trying to do something to change that system, was the chief co-sponsor with Madigan of a bill that would have only exacerbated this problem.
Okay, Senator, I know you want to respond, but let's get to Mr. Harsy. What's your take on all this?
I'm inclined to agree with Ms. Harold. When you have the Speaker of the House, you have the President of the Senate, you have city aldermen, all working at law firms that do property tax reevaluations for big corporations, while not trying to put anything that's actually real reform to kind of get these property taxes under control, they're not doing enough, and it is a scheme when that's kind of how they're operating from day to day. Unfortunately, without trying to get something under control as far as government salaries and retirement pensions, there's not a whole lot we can do to work with property taxes. But I believe that if we start holding people accountable, look to potentially nullify unconstitutional special privileges that are in violation of Article 1, Section 16 of the Illinois Constitution, then we would have money and revenue to work forward and kind of resolve some of these issues. But as is right now, with no real reform and our elected leaders working at law firms that renegotiate property taxes while simultaneously not introducing new ideas in the legislative body to resolve these problems, or you have people that are undervalued, their undervalued homes are being artificially inflated, and then big corporations hire the high-priced lawyers and then have their property taxes reduced. It's a vicious cycle to the point you could call it a scheme.
Corruption, you'd use that word?
I believe it is corrupt, absolutely.
I think it's a very dangerous thing to have a governor that engages in name calling. He uses the term corrupt. He even used it with the Illinois Supreme Court. That is why this governor has been ranked by many the worst governor in the United States of America. I note that when the governor gave Ms. Harold $1 million, he said he's supporting Ms. Harold so she can prosecute the speaker. When asked prosecute for what, he said, I hope he's committed a crime. That is dangerous. The Attorney General's office should not be used to carry out the vendettas against your political adversaries. We had an Attorney General in Pennsylvania who was prosecuted for such abuse. The Attorney General's office should not be a political office like that. And so when one supports a candidate and says, I'm supporting this candidate for this purpose, to prosecute somebody that's been an adversary. You know, I have been in Springfield. I have prided myself in working in a bipartisan manner. When Governor Raoul first started in office, he and I penned an op-ed together, pledging to work on criminal justice reform. That grew out of a conversation that I had with him early on. I didn't support him for governor, but he was elected governor, and I pledged to work with him. That's what we ought to do. We ought not engage in name calling. With regards to the innuendo with regards to property tax, I've never worked on a property tax appeals case in my life. I've never been at a firm that did any such work, but the insinuation in these commercials is that I've engaged in that type of activity. Senator Biss proposed a bill to deal with the property tax valuation system. I was a co-sponsor of that bill. So to say that I'm not engaged in trying to do something about it, I've also sponsored a resolution for a constitutional amendment to move us to a graduated income tax. I think we need to reduce the burden on property taxes to fund education in the state and shift it to income tax.
So what role, if any, and this is a question for the three of you, should the Attorney General play in the property tax debate?
I think one role that the Attorney General should play, and a role that the legislature should have already been engaged in, is setting forth legislation to amend the conflicts of interest law to preclude people who handle property tax policy in the legislature from being able to represent people in property tax appeals. Right now, in the state of Illinois, it's against the law for a lawmaker to represent a client before the Court of Claims or the Workers' Compensation Commission. The reason why that exists is there's an inherent conflict of interest. The legislature most certainly should be encompassing and expanding the conflicts of interest law to encompass property tax appeals. As Attorney General, I'm highlighting this, but this is something that the General Assembly should have long done, and that's why I'm talking about the fact that inaction is being complicit in the scheme.
Is there anything specifically the AG can do?
The Attorney General should certainly be monitoring the litigation against the Cook County Assessor's Office, or Barrios in particular, in terms of challenging some of the inequities that are pervasive within the system. But I think part of the job is to highlight the conflict of interest and call upon the General Assembly to be able to take appropriate action, which is why it was the focus of my first ad.
Senator?
I think the Attorney General can weigh in on the debate as to how we approach the evaluation system in our state and within the counties. One of the important things about the Attorney General's role, I had a conversation with General Madigan several weeks ago, and she said that she's passed more legislation as Attorney General than she ever did in the legislature. So it's important to note that the Attorney General weighs in on behalf of and in opposition to proposed policy changes in the legislature. The influence of the bully pulpit of the Attorney General and the Attorney General slipping in support and testifying in support of legislation is quite influential, and it could touch this area as well.
I think one of the biggest things to get local property taxes under control would be for the legislators to work towards creating a pay scale for government employees, somewhat equivalent to the federal government. Right now, the Secretary of State for the federal government makes $210,000 a year. To me, it's inexcusable for a superintendent of a school of 2,000 people to make $250,000 a year or $350,000 a year. Until we can control those salaries a little better, we're going to continue to see money wasted on the administrative level, and that really upticks people's pensions, which upticks in the property taxes. And we have to do something to change this vicious cycle that we're in, and I think the best way to change the cycle is a pay scale to limit the salaries of government employees in the state of Illinois.
Lisa Madigan on the national stage has been a very prominent spokesperson for net neutrality, environmental protection, including suing Donald Trump's building for river violations, predatory actions by for-profit educational institutions, data breaches, defense of healthcare, and other issues. Would you continue to be a spokesman on those issues and to fight for them the way she did?
Are you asking me or the whole group?
Both of you, but you're looking at me, so.
Excellent, I maintain good eye contact. I wouldn't hesitate to sue the federal government if I felt that they had exceeded the scope of their constitutional authority. It's the job of the Attorney General to enforce the law, to defend Illinois law, and to defend the Constitution. And so anytime I felt that the federal government had exceeded the scope of its constitutional authority, I wouldn't hesitate to file a lawsuit.
Do you agree with her on these issues?
I wouldn't be able to say on every single issue, but there are certainly times when she sued the federal government that I thought it was appropriate. To give you an example, I think it was appropriate to sue the federal government when they were withholding some of the funds from law enforcement in communities as a result of the federal government's belief that the Trust Act did not comply with federal law. I believe that it was appropriate for her to sue because the Trust Act was specifically designed to comply with federal law. If anything, I would be critical of her for not filing the lawsuit sooner, because initially she weighed in with an amicus brief which did not seek a resolution for the people of Illinois. And I think that your job is to approach this position as you would a real attorney. And so I think it was appropriate for her to file a lawsuit because the Trust Act does comply with federal law, and as a result, communities throughout Illinois are entitled to those law enforcement funds.
Listen, my opponent has previously referred to these lawsuits as purely political.
That's false.
It's important to really address your question on an issue-by-issue basis. Does she or does she not support the Attorney General's? There's a litigation going on in the state of Texas right now to protect the Affordable Care Act. Does she or not? Does she not support Lisa Madigan and other Attorney Generals stepping up to protect the Affordable Care Act? Does she or does she not support the Attorney General, Lisa Madigan, and Attorney General Maura Healy from Massachusetts stepped up to take on predatory lenders in higher education? Does she or does she not support that? These are very simple questions. Does she or does she not support keeping families together? The Attorney General stepped up. It was Attorney Generals who stepped up to fight the Trump administration's efforts to separate immigrant families. The role of the Attorney General is more important right now than any time in American history because of the Attorney General's Attorneys General role collectively and individually stepping up, fighting against the federal government's overreach. I was at an ABA conference most recently where Cheryl and Eiffel from the CP Legal Defense Fund, noted that it used to be the U.S. Attorney General that would come into the state to protect the citizenry. Now it's the attorneys generals at the state level who protect the citizenry from the overreach of the federal government. Lisa Madigan stepped up where Jeff Sessions stepped back with regards to the consent decree right here in Chicago.
Well, let's ask about that specific one. Lisa Madigan, I think one reason Chicago now has a consent decree for the Chicago Police Force Department is because Lisa Madigan pushed the issue. Surprised me a little bit. Do you have a take on whether, would you in this position support that consent decree, and what's your take on it?
I think kind of the consent decree is somewhat a feel-good piece of paper. I don't think it takes 255 pages to outline to the police department that they have to respect people's constitutional rights. I think they're aware that they know when not to tase people and when it's appropriate. So if we're not going to start holding our bad acting police officers accountable, we can pass as many consent decrees as we want, and it's not going to change anything. Okay. We need to start holding cops accountable to the same standard of law like regular citizens are held to.
If you were at AG, what's your view on the consent decree?
I have repeatedly said that I support the consent decree. As Attorney General, I will pursue full compliance with the consent decree. I think this consent decree offers a transformational moment for the city of Chicago in terms of reforming the police department and setting forth concrete benchmarks for being able to effectuate the change that we need. Everything from trauma-informed care, community policing efforts, additional resources within communities. I think it's important that we also move towards some prevention, expanding after-school programs to give young people safe places to be after school. So I wholeheartedly support that, and I think it's important that you have an Attorney General that weighs in on those issues as well.
So is there any difference between you two on the consent decree, on your take on it?
I'm not certain. I mean, because the consent decree, as been noted, is a very detailed document, so I don't know my opponent's perspective on every aspect of the consent decree. Okay. But I do agree that it was important for Lisa Madigan to step forth where Jeff Sessions stepped back. And it's consistent with the role that attorneys general are playing nationally. Lisa Madigan actually consulted with Representative L.G. Sims and myself before she took action on this, because we were both active on law enforcement reform in the legislature. We passed a comprehensive law enforcement reform package in the legislature that the Obama administration noted was a model for the rest of the country. I agree with Bubba that the consent decree by itself doesn't address all of the concerns of law enforcement. I think we need to continue to work on the issue, and I have historically worked on it, and I pledge to continue to do so as Attorney General.
Erika, you had a question?
Let's shift gears back to today's Sun-Times. Mm-hmm. We say in today's Sun-Times, Senator, that your campaign makes a false claim about Ms. Harold's stand on gay adoption. The ads that we're talking about say that she would discriminate against a loving gay couple who want to adopt a child, favoring an abusive straight couple instead. The ad says she supports a constitutional ban on same-sex marriage and would even allow employers to fire workers just for being gay. Ms. Harold has said that at one time she wouldn't have supported same-sex couples adopting, but that she would strongly support it today. Your campaign says her evolution is incredible. How can you say that?
Well, you know, the notion that what she said when she was 19, that she could evolve from that, I support that notion. But when did the evolution take place? It certainly didn't take place in 2014 when she explicitly said that she was against marriage equality. It certainly didn't take place in 2014 when she was running for Congress, when she said in an Illinois Family Institute questionnaire that she would support the discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. The credibility comes into question. Yeah, if it's just referring to when she was 19, but the very last time Ms. Harold was running for office, she took these positions. Now, what she has said today is because the Supreme Court has ruled on marriage equality, that her position has changed. It's very important to listen to the specificity of what she says. Right now, there's a Supreme Court justice that is being considered to replace the pivotal voice in the marriage equality case. So what the Supreme Court's stance on marriage equality could change after if Brett Kavanaugh is confirmed. So if her change in position is based on the Supreme Court's decision, not on her own conviction, not on her own personal views, which she has historically said does not matter, I feel uncomfortable with that.
I think it's important to focus on words because words matter. The central premise of your campaign, of 3 ads that you've run, is that I currently have certain positions about same-sex adoption. You're sitting today saying that you actually don't believe that those are my current views. So if you don't, so do you believe that that's my current view right now?
I absolutely do, because
so you actually believe that that is what I currently believe, based on what evidence?
You're asking me a question, let me answer.
Yes, based on what evidence?
Like I just said, one of the fundamental things about
Evidence.
Let me reply. If you want to speak over me, I'll allow you to finish. If you ask me a question, I'll patiently wait for you to finish asking me the question.
I want to hear evidence, so please present it.
I'm about to present it. I just did present it.
Okay.
One of the fundamental things when you think about raising children, like one of the structures that people rely on to raise children is marriage, right? There's a value of raising children when married. If you're saying that the only reason why you support marriage equality is because of the Supreme Court's decision, and the Supreme Court's posture on this can change with the pending appointment that's pending right now. It's not about your personal view.
Let me phrase this question.
No, I want him to answer his question about the claim that he's been making that was rated false,
Yeah, I
completely
understand.
false.
And I think his answer was that he believes that your position now has less to do with personal conviction, more on what you think the legal reality is.
No.
So let me ask you, if the legal reality were to
No, I
change-
want to focus
I
on the
understand, but I
same-sex
have a
adoption,
question.
the same-sex adoption, because
Yeah.
when I have actually said what my rationale is for my position on same-sex adoption, I said that I support same-sex couples being able to adopt and be able to be foster parents because I believe they provide loving homes and because I believe no child should be in an abusive environment. So I referenced nothing about the Constitution as it relates to the issue of same-sex adoption and same-sex couples being able to be foster parents. That's the premise of his first ad. That's the premise of his second ad. And I want him to account for why that's on the air still when it has been rated as false. I stated what my position was in March. I just stated what my position is in April. I have continued to state it. And at no point in 2014 did I ever say anything contrary to that. So again, where is your evidence for saying that I do not support same-sex couples being able to adopt or be foster parents?
The family structure that most same-sex couples would adopt in is marriage. If you're not in support of marriage, but for a Supreme Court's opinion, I don't believe that your position has changed.
I would be in
Erika,
support
I
of
know,
people
I
being
have a
able
very
to,
simple
single
question.
people
If the
being able
Supreme
to.
Court changed the law on same-sex marriage, and same-sex marriage was no longer the law of the land, would that change anything with your views on same-sex couples adopting children?
Of course not. And I want to hear some evidence still. You have an ad on the air that's defamatory, and I still have heard you say nothing about your evidentiary basis for the premise of your ad. When your comms person was asked about it, as quoted in the Sun-Times, there was no evidence. I've never said anything linking marriage to being able to, for couples to being able to adopt.
Okay.
Single people are able to be foster parents. You don't have any basis for what you're saying, so you have no basis for having those ads on the air.
It's okay for us to disagree, but you first said, I don't recall making a statement. Then you said, well, if I did make the statement, I've evolved from that. Your credibility has to be questioned. If I made a statement like that, I would recall whether or not I made such a statement.
Can I ask
Okay.
to that real quick? I'm sorry to be very quick. What is the evidence that you believe that she said this? Because I believe it's based on an NBC story with 3 unnamed sources. Is there any additional proof that you or your campaign
I think the proof is in her response. Again, if I don't know what your feeling is, but if I were asked whether or not I made such a statement, it's not something that I would forget whether or not I made, especially in the context of a competition like that. So I think, you know, the evidence, if credibility on that, is in her response.
I also think that you were happy to agree with Governor Edgar's comments about the importance of not defaming people simply because you may disagree with them on certain issues. The fact that you have an ad up there is defamatory. And the fact that you were trying to make the entire premise of your campaign against me about something that anonymous sources say that I might have said when I was 19 years old speaks to the fact that you do not have a good record in Springfield on which to run. And I would think that you would take Governor Edgar's words and be able to talk about what it is that you've accomplished in Springfield that you think is good for people, as opposed to trying to focus on something that I might have said 20 years ago in a beauty pageant.
I'd be very happy to. I've been very explicit about my support for marriage equality. I voted for marriage equality. I've been very explicit about my support for the Equal Rights Amendment.
We're
Very
going
explicit.
to move to another question.
Can I just throw in something briefly?
Lorraine.
I want to ask about gun violence and the role of an attorney general in doing something about gun violence, taking on, if you want to call it that, the NRA, doing something about the pipeline of guns across state lines into Chicago. What would each of you do about that?
I feel like the biggest thing in dealing with that is government accountability and treating the criminal as more of a mental issue rather than straightforward.
Okay, but I'm asking about gun violence and doing something about the pipeline of guns. I understand about mental health. I agree. Pipeline of guns, ability of people to get guns illegally on the street. That's what I want to know about, period.
Going towards government accountability, the individual that did the school shooting in Florida, he was red flagged by the FBI and I believe the local police department, and they were aware that this individual had serious issues. But for whatever reason, he fell through the cracks and nobody was held accountable. Nobody lost their job by allowing him to fall through the cracks. Illinois and Chicago have some of the toughest, most restrictive gun laws in the nation. I don't think just continuing to outlaw guns is going to get us where we need to be. If it did, we could outlaw cancer, we could outlaw AIDS, we could outlaw diabetes, and it would fix those problems. It's not, but I mean,
I don't think your question calls for outlawing guns. I think we can take steps in gun tracing, for example. The city of Chicago is engaged in tracing guns involved in crimes. The New York Attorney General's office similarly is involved on a statewide basis in tracing guns that are involved in crimes. That tracing process is critical to finding the original source of the guns that are intentionally trafficked into the hands of people that we know are going to do bad with them. The other thing is that we've tried to take steps on in the legislature that I've supported, I've been a chief co-sponsor of, is gun dealer licensing. We have certain bad actors within the state that are responsible for trafficking a high percentage of the guns involved in crimes. We have to take responsibility for licenses on gun
and
dealers.
once we trace where these guns come from, because we know a lot of them come from Indiana, then what? I mean, what can be done about that?
Well, then if you can demonstrate a pattern, as has been done in Wisconsin, there was civil action taken against a gun dealer. And so if you have to have the evidence to take action. So that's where the gun tracing comes in.
Erika Harold?
I think my approach to gun violence as Attorney General would focus on the different ways in which gun violence manifests itself, whether it's violence within schools, domestic violence, gang violence. I think it's very important to be clear about the kind of violence that we're talking about. So specifically, when you're talking about domestic violence, because oftentimes when a woman is trying to leave someone who's abusive, that's a very critical time. So making sure that those orders of protection that are enforcing current Illinois law that says people are not able to have access to weapons if a judge adjudicates them as being dangerous, that's something that I think is really important.
So is there any need for additional gun laws to restrict or to monitor the flow of guns or is it just a question of pursuing or enacting or respecting our current laws?
I think that right now we have to make sure we're vigorously enforcing the laws that are on the books and finding out, are there loopholes that exist?
So for
And
instance, a state gun license, gun dealer license?
right now we have federal licensing, and I don't think that we have the resources right now to institute a state system that would be largely duplicative.
Okay. Marilyn, you got some Facebook questions, right?
Yeah, we do. We're really happy to take some questions on Facebook today, and this is a good one from Amisha Cross. On Facebook, she says, U.S. Attorney General Jeff Sessions recently said there is too much suppression of free and open speech on college campuses today. Do you believe this is an issue in Illinois? But I think if it were to become an issue, how should the AG respond?
Well, I don't think it's an issue. I mean, I was just on a college campus this past weekend, and I see the open exchange of ideas. I live right by the University of Chicago. There's a free and open exchange of expression and ideas. And it's not the first time I've disagreed with Jeff Sessions, but I love the engagement of college students. They're very active in politics right now, and they're very active from various diverse perspectives, weighing in on a wide variety of issues. I don't see the challenge.
I think it's important that students have the ability to be able to freely engage, and I think that a lot of the discourse that you see right now is really positive. Last night I was at the campus of ISU speaking to the minority students for political action and political change, and I was telling them that their voices matter and that they need to be involved in campaigns, they need to find issues about which they care deeply, and to be engaged and express their opinion. I think that it's important that we show how you can disagree about certain ideas. People are going to hold passionate views, and so to the extent there's anything that we should be doing, it's maybe encouraging people to express their viewpoints, but do so in a way that maintains civility. But I think you always want more speech, people engaged in the process, because that's what's necessary for a vibrant democracy.
As a libertarian, you must have.
I can't believe I'm going to agree with Jeff Sessions on something, but I think there are some problems with free speech on college campuses. A couple weeks ago, I was at the University of Illinois in Springfield, and one of the problems they're having is being able to actively engage on campus immediately when something's in the news. Right now, they have like a 48-hour window where they have to have pre-approval where they can openly discuss topics, and that is somewhat problematic. Whenever there's a hot button issue, you want to be able to get out and discuss it now. In that 48-hour window, some of those individuals on campus find it somewhat restrictive and is limiting their free speech. So I'd like to kind of open that up and shorten those windows and those restrictions.
Do you see any sort of restrictions that are necessary on speech on campuses?
I mean, I believe you need to have some appropriate levels and give people certain avenues. Like, I don't want to encourage hate speech to the point that people are uncomfortable on campus, but they're trying to discuss and engage in political activities, and they're meeting these 48-hour restrictions, and they feel like that's kind of tying their hands a little bit.
Do you have any other Facebook questions?
Yeah, here's a good one. Here's a favorite topic of mine. Recreational marijuana. Do you support the legalization of recreational pot in Illinois? And this comes from Ivy Rochelle.
Yeah, I do, but the devil's in the details. I think we've moved in that direction. I voted and supported the use of medical cannabis and the recent expansion to cover it as a alternative to opioid-based painkillers. I voted for the decriminalization of marijuana. But with regards to total legalization, it's important to have parameters around it. I think today's marijuana is not your granddaddy's marijuana. It comes in all sorts of potencies, and it's marketed in all sorts of forms in terms of gummy bears, soda pops, and things like that that could be targeted towards children. And I think we would need some regulations surrounding that.
But what about people who are in jail today or in, serving prison sentences because of pot-related offenses? What do you do about that? Do you do anything about that, in your opinion?
Well, it depends on the circumstances, the basis of them being in jail. If they were trafficking large amounts of marijuana when marijuana was illegal, they broke the law. So it depends on the circumstances. If it's a personal use situation, that's different from trafficking large amounts of marijuana. I mean, we have controlled substances that are legally sold by pharmaceutical companies. Somebody can be in jail right now for illegally marketing, trafficking large amounts of opioid-based painkillers.
Right.
Although opioid-based painkillers are legal to be sold.
Got it. Ms. Harold?
I do support legalizing marijuana for a variety of reasons. First of all, I think there are some economic benefits for the state of Illinois to be able to obtain. I also think from a criminal justice and mass incarceration perspective, I think we see too many people who are incarcerated for nonviolent offenses. Obviously, we want to have legislation that's going to be able to address these issues in a very prudent way and to bring all of the stakeholders together to address the variety of issues that are going to come up in terms of regulation and making sure that we are allocating resources appropriately. I would like to see some of the profits that come from legalizing marijuana to go towards the opioid epidemic, which is a very serious public health crisis within our state, and we need more treatment facilities, we need more mental health resources, and I think that's where law enforcement's resources should go. In terms of retroactive application of legalizing, I think if you are talking about personal use and also people whose plea agreements might have been based upon those laws, I think it is an opportunity, it is important to give them the opportunity to be able to go back and to address those issues, because if we believe that it's unjust for people to be incarcerated for nonviolent drug offenses, then I think we have to make sure that we are expanding the scope of that justice to as many people as possible.
Mr. Harsy?
I believe in the legalization of marijuana across the board. I believe, on top of what they were saying, helping with the economy, it also, I mean, going on top of that, the laws are racially enforced. That is a problem. Cops go into neighborhoods where they have a higher chance of success with the convictions and arrests going. That's usually in underserved areas and minority areas. That is a problem that we need to address. As far as people that are currently arrested for marijuana charges, if they're non-violent offenders, I feel like we need to get them out of prison. I don't think it's worth $40,000 to $50,000 a year caging one of these individuals for having a plant that has never killed anybody. We need to look at that and try to get those people out of there in an effort to reduce costs for the taxpayers in Illinois, and that is a simple way to reduce costs. Also, I feel like by legalizing marijuana, it can reduce healthcare costs. Right now, when people shift from typical prescription drugs to medical marijuana, they're able to replace 5 to 8 prescription drugs. That's a lot. That reduces healthcare costs across the board if you can allow people to grow marijuana plants in their garden. It's never killed anybody. If they want to self-medicate, and then not have to pay an insurance company, not have to pay a pharmaceutical company, not have to pay a doctor, I don't see why we should prevent that from happening.
Where do you see the evidence that it can replace, what did you say, 5 or 8?
5 to 8. I can't recall where I've read that from, but people are able to replace their anxiety medications, their opioid medications, high blood pressure pills. There's just an assortment of pharmaceuticals that can be replaced with medical marijuana and recreational marijuana. And since there's no risk of death associated with it, why not let people grow it themselves?
Okay.
Ms. Harold, if you're Attorney General, will you open an investigation of Mike Madigan? I really feel like your commercials and everything are at least leaving that impression.
My commercials certainly do not leave that impression. What I would do is open an investigation if I was Attorney General, if people brought me evidence of any sort of public misconduct and it was within my jurisdiction. From the very beginning of my campaign, I've talked about the importance of combating public corruption, and I've defined what I mean by public corruption. So when people violate conflicts of interest laws, when people engage in patronage hiring or contracts that don't go through the appropriate process and protocol. But I've been very clear that the Office of Attorney General should never be used to punish political opponents, and I would not use the power of the office in that way, because that would be an abuse of power.
So as you sit here today, have you been brought anything to tell you that Mike Madigan has broken a law? You know, you've got people that talk to you through the political ranks. the governor included?
People have not given me evidence that he has broken the law. What I have seen in terms of the conflicts of interest laws that exist within our state, I believe they need to be expanded because not everything that is legal is ethical. And I think our property tax assessment system and the conflicts of interest laws that permit people to be able to profit from their position, I think those need to be changed. But I would not use the Office of Attorney General to punish political opponents. I'm also not going to use the time as a campaign to engage in hypotheticals about particular individuals. I stand by the words that I speak, I stand by the commercials that I put out, and I stand by fighting for being able to hold both parties accountable because that's something that people within our state want to see and it's something they deserve.
Senator, I don't think we got back to you on this issue of should legislators be prohibited from doing property tax appeal work?
I think that's something that's worthy of debate. One of the things that you have to note is it's a question of conflict of interest, and the legislature touches on just about every. I chair the Judiciary Committee. We touch on every area of the practice of law. So if you're doing it based on the legislature having some influence on that area of the law, you're going to have to ban the lawyers from serving in the legislature, because the legislature influences every area of practice on a week-to-week basis in the legislature. So the notion of the conflict of interest that's created, as Ms. Harold pointed out earlier, practicing before the Illinois Industrial Commission, because that is the state of Illinois' tribunal, there's an inherent conflict there. Because the Court of Claims is the state of Illinois' tribunal, there's an inherent conflict there. But if we're going to begin to say that in any area that the legislature influences the law, legislators are not going to be able to, legislative lawyers or whatever the profession may be, you're conflicted out. I don't know where to exactly draw the line on that.
I mean, it's not a new issue. You must have considered it before now.
No, but what I'm saying, Mark, is you have to be consistent in drawing what is going to be a conflict. If the basis of that is going to be that the legislature has influence on this area of practice, the legislature has influence on every area of practice.
I think maybe a little bit what Mark's getting at, but certainly what I'm interested in, it seems that when you answer that way, you are implicitly saying that you would not be in favor of this sort of a rule, that you can't be a legislator and do property tax work.
I think
the issue's been on the table for years and years and years, and your response is to say, well, I'm concerned about whether or not you could carve out this exemption without having created a precedent.
And I legitimately have that concern.
So the answer seems to me is your answer is no. They shouldn't do that.
Unless I can it can be demonstrated that
After all
that
this
is
time, you
distinguishable.
would know whether it could be demonstrated, right?
It hasn't been. It hasn't really been debated in great detail in the legislature. Not at all. Yeah, I chair the Judiciary Committee.
Well, I think if he wanted that debated in the legislature, he could have had that debated because he, in fact, has been in the legislature for 14 years. And that's an issue that is a persistent one. People have written series about the property tax appeals process and the flaws and inherent conflicts of interest. And if somebody wants to continue serving in the legislature, they just shouldn't do property tax appeals. If they want to do property tax appeals, they shouldn't serve in the legislature. We're not telling them which one to choose, but we're saying choose the people's interest and don't maintain this conflict of interest.
Can I ask, Senator, we talked about this during the primary about utility companies, and you've since received a lot more contributions from utility companies. Is there an insinuation there that you will be more friendly towards these companies? And I also wanted to ask the other candidates about how you would deal with utility companies, since Lisa Madigan was a pretty strong fighter against utility companies.
Yeah, and Lisa Madigan, prior to her becoming Attorney General, took contributions from utility companies. It did not stop her from being that strong fighter against utility companies. I've served in the legislature for 14 years. I've received contributions from a wide range of different individuals and entities, many of which disagree with one another. No contribution has dictated the way that I've acted in my official capacity.
And what about your priorities if you were to win in terms of fighting the utility companies? Is that a priority for you?
My priority would be to advocate on behalf of the people of the state of Illinois. It's not necessarily a priority aimed at utility companies, aimed at
consumer advocacy.
right, it's consumer advocacy, exactly. And sometimes, like in the future, an example is the Future Energy Jobs Act, where the Citizens Utility Board, the Sierra Club, and ComEd were all on the same page. I felt like I was advocating on behalf of consumers and people of the state of Illinois. So the way it was framed, is my aim going to be to fight against utility companies? No, it's going to be to fight on behalf of consumers.
I believe with respect to utility companies, the role is to advocate for consumer interests, making sure they're protected, making sure that you have a level playing field, and not picking winners and losers. I think in terms of contributions, the goal is to make sure that you're not taking contributions where you're going to be actively involved in some sort of litigation involving somebody who's making a contribution. And that's why I would take issue with Senator Raoul taking contributions from tobacco companies where the Attorney General currently will be administering the settlements. To me, that's a conflict of interest and a contribution that should not be accepted.
My focus will be to protect the consumers of Illinois, the people of Illinois. Depending on which corporation I have to go after in order to make sure the people of Illinois are protected, it doesn't matter. That is what the Attorney General should do, and we've had that a little bit on the consumer protection side for the last 15 years, but as far as dealing with the government, we haven't had somebody looking out for the people's interest in a very long time. But whatever company, whatever corporations, it doesn't matter. I will be looking out for the interest of the people of Illinois.
So we're actually coming up on an hour. It's been an hour. You meant to keep it to an hour, but we'll just a little bit longer. Marilyn, I
We
think.
started a little late.
All right, yeah.
We can go with 5 minutes, 10
Yeah,
minutes.
we're going a little over. So Marilyn, you had a couple of questions, and we're going to try to move to the end, though.
Right, on Facebook, Cecil Matthews writes in to ask if there are any actions that the AG can take to protect families from predatory lending in the against for-profit college businesses.
Yeah, well, I mean, Lisa Madigan and Maura Healy are involved in that right now, where Betsy DeVos is rolling back the protections that Arne Duncan and the Obama administration put in place. To their credit, Maura Healy and Lisa Madigan stepped up where the federal government was stepping back. And again, I reiterate, I think the role of the Attorney General is ever so more important than any time in American history because of what's happening from the Republican administration at the federal level.
And you would continue to fight?
Absolutely.
Ms. Harold?
I think that there are a variety of things that you can do as Attorney General. One, you can make sure you can use the office's visibility to make sure that people are reporting things to the office, because you have the ability to investigate patterns and practices that start to become apparent as a result of people giving information. You also have the ability to try to advocate for greater amounts of disclosure for some of these colleges. Additionally, you have this bully pulpit where you can try to use the office's power to be able to educate people about some of the issues related to the loans that they might be entering into, and highlights interest rates, things like balloon payments, co-signing issues, making sure that you are making the information very accessible to people. One of the things that I think that the Attorney General's office should be doing is making much better use of technology and the ability to communicate with people directly about the real-world implications of contracts into which they're entering, and trying to make it clear to people some of the things to be looking out for, because part of consumer protection issues is being able to arm consumers with as much information as possible.
So I'm a little unclear, though. Does that mean you do or do not support Lisa Madigan's current efforts to crack down on predatory lenders for college?
I do support her efforts to do
Is there
that.
anything she's doing that you would not agree with or not support?
With respect to
With respect to
predatory
the
lending,
lenders.
I think I support what she's doing to try to make sure that there's proper disclosure and to make sure that they are held accountable.
Okay.
Generally, I support going after predatory lenders, but I think going even a step further, when we are aware of individuals setting up these predatory loans, and then we do begin to investigate them, and then other people help kind of cover up the bad acts, I feel like we need to hold the people accountable that are trying to cover up these bad acts as accomplices to the crime.
Okay.
In Illinois, we have a large population of immigrants. I think we're number 4, 5, or 6 when it comes to an immigrant population. In light of the fear imposed by the Trump administration on immigrants and the deportations that the administration has been carrying out, do you support the concept of the AG's office developing policies for courthouses, schools, and other public and some private institutions like hospitals, developing policies on how they should handle immigration enforcement activity? Ms. Harold, the governor just vetoed a bill that would allow that. So I'm wondering if you could start, would you be comfortable taking on that kind of role?
What I would be comfortable doing is, first of all, making sure that the Trust Act is enforced. I also would be comfortable making sure that Illinois statutorily requires the Attorney General to develop an immigration assistance program where you are trying to make sure that people are aware of their rights. I don't think it's the role of the Attorney General to micromanage each and every specific entity that you identified, because there are going to be reasons why they need to be complying with the law in the ways that make the most sense for their sector. But I would absolutely be committed to making sure the Trust Act is enforced and making sure that I was communicating with the immigrant population within the state of Illinois to make sure that they were aware of their rights and to know that those rights would be respected and protected.
Senator?
The governor vetoed the Safe Zones Act to try to regain support in his base. And it's very clear. It wasn't about the substance of the Safe Zones Act. As Attorney General, first off, I voted in support of the legislation. I would advocate, I would use the advocacy role that the Attorney General plays in the legislature to pass it again, and hopefully there'll be a new governor that will sign it into law. I'm the son of Haitian immigrants that made great contributions to this country. My dad served as a community physician, who never turned back a patient. Immigrants, both immigrants who are undocumented and those who have visas, make tremendous contributions to our country. They pay taxes, yet they don't get the full benefit of the taxes that they pay. We have to create safe places. After the Supreme Court overturned the Janus decision, the Attorney General's office issued guidelines as to how to function post-Janus. Similarly, I think it'd be appropriate for the Attorney General's office to issue guidelines as you suggested in your question.
Mr. Harsy, where do the Libertarians stand on this?
Depends on which Libertarian you ask. Personally, I would like to see the Attorney General's office have guidelines on how to handle immigration, but at the same time, we're putting the cart before the horse if we don't have federal approval for something like that. To me, immigration is a federal issue, and without a constitutional amendment, it's going to maintain being a federal issue. So the states can spend a lot of taxpayer resources if they want to establish guidelines, but without the approval of the federal government saying, all right, we're going to pass off immigration to the states, we're just kind of doing what we want until the federal government tells us we can no longer do that. And that's kind of the situation we're in right now, where Trump's kind of, everybody was on board when Obama gave the deferred action. Now Trump's trying to take it back, and everybody's worried what Trump might do. We can have as many AG guidelines as we want until the federal government gives us the authority to handle it. We're not really handling it. We can pretend like we are, but we're not.
So let's get one last question, and then we'll call it a day here. Is anybody?
Mark, what can I ask this? At least one area where Lisa Madigan's been criticized is in pursuing victims' rights and also crimes against children, sex crimes against children, that she's been overzealous to the point where innocent people could be caught up or may have been caught up in the legal system. Would you pursue the same policies as Attorney General?
I think there's the very top priority in my administration as Attorney General would be to protect children. The Attorney General is charged with responsibility in 101 of the 102 counties of running the Internet Crime Against Children Task Force. I've consulted with a retired detective who's focused on these internet crimes, and it's incredible how we think our children are safe when they're in our living rooms or in their bedrooms, when they're on a tablet or on a handheld or on a laptop, and they're in a chat room and there's a child pornographer or child predator in that room with them. So we may think that our children are safe, but they're not safe. And that responsibility that the Attorney General's office has is a very serious one. Protecting children from gun violence is another front. You know, one of the things, I used to be a juvenile prosecutor. I served both on the child welfare side, child protection side, as well as on the delinquency side. When a minor would come in having committed a crime, I would do a background check. And in a high percentage of time, that minor had been into juvenile court system before as a victim of abuse and neglect. It would be a top priority of
What
mine.
about when victims' rights comes up against due process?
Well, that's due process. I would always operate under under the structure of due process. That doesn't mean that making sure that there's due process doesn't mean that you're not zealous with regards to protecting children. That's got to be a top priority, and it would be a top priority for me.
I think that making sure that victims' rights are protected is something that is the highest priority. I'm someone who's been the victim of racial and sexual harassment. I know many people who have been victims in a variety of ways, and making sure that people have process and procedure that protects them is very important. One of the things that I would change with respect to how Lisa Madigan has handled the Crime Victim Services Bureau is trying to better make sure that those dollars are equitably dispersed to communities that are affected by trauma. I do town halls and I meet with people in a variety of settings. And one of the criticisms that's brought to my attention time and time again is that people feel that those dollars are not equitably dispersed to as many groups that are actually impacted by violence. So one of the things that I would want to do first and foremost is to try to chart exactly where those dollars are going and to make sure that communities that are impacted by violence are in a position to be able to fully be meaningfully impacted by it. I've been involved in victims' rights services for quite some time. I've made preventing youth violence and bullying a national imperative of mine since 2002, and I've received national recognition for being able to leverage not just the law, but cultural changes to be able to lead reform on those sorts of issues. And I would use the Attorney General's platform to continue to do that.
You definitely have to protect the interests of the children and victims' rights, as well as adhering to the due process. That being said, I feel like one of the issues where in Illinois we dropped the ball biggest in protecting our children is, this has occurred to me locally, I've seen it happen. It seems like if a government employee, a coach, a teacher is involved sexually with a child, they get a free pass for whatever reason. They're kind of forced to resign. There's questions around the resignation, why it happened, and turns out they were most likely a sexual predator. To me, if we're really going to protect our children's interests, then we have to start holding those people accountable. And on top of that, anybody that helps somebody get away with a heinous crime like that, we have to hold them accountable as an accomplice. That's the only way to legitimately protect the people of Illinois, is holding our bad acting government employees accountable just like they're regular people.
Okay, listen, we're over, but I want to err on the side of letting my folks get their last questions in, because you guys are stuck with us. So what I'd like to do is give Lorraine as a question and then end with Mark Brown, if that's okay with you folks. So Lorraine?
My question has to do a little bit about who you are and why you're running. You, Bubba, and Erika, you've never held elected office before, and you're running for statewide office, and why? And Senator, you've been around a while. You know, are your opponents would probably say you're part of the problem. You've been around, people have been around in Springfield, you've been around too long, it's time for something new. So after I hear from them, I want to hear your response.
For me personally, I don't feel like the Democrats or Republicans have provided me with an attorney general to protect my interest in pretty much my entire life. I don't think Roland Burris was looking out for the people's interest of Illinois. I don't believe Jim Ryan was looking out for the people's interest of Illinois, and I don't believe Lisa Madigan was in regards to government corruption. That has motivated me to run. I will legitimately hold the government accountable for their bad acts, and I feel like that is what the people of Illinois need more than anything.
I think I touched on a personal level why this job is so important to me is because I come from a background where I understand what it's like to feel marginalized and powerless. I had to leave my high school when I was in high school because I was the victim of racial and sexual harassment. And that experience of feeling marginalized is what ultimately led me to become an attorney. It's led me to be involved in a lot of advocacy work that impacts the justice system. So I'm on the Illinois Supreme Court Committee on Equality. I'm a commissioner on the Illinois Supreme Court Commission on Professionalism, where we look to eradicate bias within the legal system. I also am involved in prison ministry and criminal justice reform. And when I see the priorities that need to be set by the Office of Attorney General, I see the need for innovation. I also see the need for reform-minded, independent outsiders that are willing to hold both parties accountable. And so the fact that I've never held elected office is one of the reasons why a lot of people are going to be voting for me in November, because they want someone who's not been part of the system.
The question touches on who I am, and you touched on my experience. Whether I'm part of the problem in my years of service, I don't think abolishing the death penalty when we were second only to the state of Florida and the number of innocent people we sent to death row is creating a problem. I don't think passing the strongest voting rights protection in the country by way of the Illinois Voting Rights Act and a constitutional amendment to protect voting rights is part of the problem. I don't think expanding access to health care is part of the problem. I don't think working in a bipartisan manner to pass workers' compensation reform is part of the problem. But beyond my experience, and I think you touch on a distinction between my opponents and I, and that's experience, both professionally as an attorney and as a policymaker. I'm the only person here that has ever prosecuted a case. I'm the only person here that has ever negotiated a labor contract, ever represented a public entity in employment discrimination or tort case, which Attorney General's office is charged with doing. I also bring my personal experience as a son of immigrants, as a father of two college children, children that I had to come home to after there was gun violence on multiple occasions directly outside of my home. I bring to bear to this challenge all of those experiences combined, and I think that distinguishes me from my opponents.
Let's just cut it off there.
You have the last question?
I think we need to ask Senator Raoul if he's running for the mayor.
Heck no.
No chance?
You could cut it down to 30 now.
Well, listen, then we're out of questions. It's been great. Thanks for coming in, and it's been a good conversation. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.